Good afternoon, everyone. We'd like to go ahead and get started. I'm Lisa White from UC Berkeley, and I'm chair of the AGU Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Committee. And I'm pleased that some of my fellow committee members are co-chairing the session. So Leslie Wyburn here and Benjamin Kiesling. And we certainly, with the speakers and panelists that so kindly accepted our invitation to speak, I mean, we truly do have more than a century of collective leadership in diversity and inclusion, and we're certainly looking forward to hearing all their stories, as well as some suggestions on how we can move forward. And it's my pleasure to introduce the president of AGU, Robin Bell, who will start the session. Thank you.
Thanks. Oops, let me get closer. Thanks, everybody, for coming today. I'm Robin Bell, and I am president of AGU, and I'm now co-author with Lisa on an EOS piece about diversity in the geosciences. And I'm really proud to welcome you to this. I'm really proud of the leadership AGU has taken and how we as a community are really working to have the resources to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this event really recognizes the efforts that AGU has made to address diversity, equity, and inclusion in science, technology, and engineering, and math, but that we all have to be change agents. I think I talked Lisa into using the terminology that we want AGU to be this Spider-Verse of science. You know, we really want it to be welcoming, and we want everybody to have, you know, the tools to move forward and to be successful. We've made a lot of changes in the community. You know, when I started, there were very few women, and forget anything else in terms of diversity. But now we really have taken it on as a value that to encourage diversity and create an inclusive culture. This year, in terms of diversity, we actually have, AGU's meeting has 40% international participation. So we aren't just diversifying in terms of gender or racial background, but really internationally. But we're also looking at a different kind of diversity. We're looking at how our work is becoming increasingly interdisciplinary. And with this is actually the conversation that Benjamin and I were just having, is about how as we become increasingly interdisciplinary and we look to addressing not just scientific, but societal challenges, we have to think about how we do our work differently. We have to think about how we co-produce knowledge. We just don't work with communities and tell them what we think we know because we're so smart. But we actually work with them to find out what the questions that they need addressed are, and then work together to both produce the knowledge and work together to deliver the knowledge. I'm also very proud of the community-wide action we've seen. I will admit, last night was the second year in a row where the diversity and inclusion reception was like a mind-boggling, brain-opening event. You know, last year it was just recognizing that we are not being open to anybody with disabilities. You know, I went from greeting all these young students in Washington in wheelchairs who were so excited at our science, and then standing on the stage and looking at the screen, and everybody up there was being Macho 101 in Indiana Jones. And we were not making space or offering heroes to people who can't stand on mountaintops or balance in front of the bows of ships. So this year, the movie, and thank you for everybody who was involved with presenting that event last night. It was really mind-blowing, and I can't wait to share it with more people and the insights with it. And I think it just points to that we're all working together to meet this challenge. We're really working together to make sure we have a way to provide the resources to our community, and really that our goal is that our science is better, and our community and our species will be better when we all figure out how to open the doors and work collaboratively. So I'm looking forward to learning more about how to be change agents for our science. And thank you for everybody who's organized it. I appreciate your leadership.
So I'd like to welcome Dr. Warren Washington to the stage. He's been literally a pioneer in atmospheric sciences for decades. And all of the years that he's been at NCAR, in early years just pioneering the recruiting of underrepresented students. So we thank you for being here.
Thank you. I'm going to speak about a program that we've had at NCAR for several decades, maybe three. And it's a very broad program. In the 1970s and 1980s, they asked me if I would try to get more diversity into atmospheric science. I'm on the second a person that is an African American who's gotten a PhD. And at that time, there was a Charlie Anderson who was the first. He was a former Tuskegee airman, except he was on the forecasting for the airmen in Europe. Well, anyway, I traipsed around to black colleges and I visited colleges in the East and also in the Southeast. Even went to my father's college, which was Talladega in Alabama. And I only was able to attract maybe one or two students a year. And we actually broadened that program. Whoops. Whoops. I guess I went too far. Push the button. Backspace. Yeah. And we also visited colleges with significant populations of Native Americans and Latino students. And out of that, we sort of had to kind of take a real look at how we were doing it, and we came up with a much broader program. And I'll talk about the elements of that. This one right here. Yeah. Now our students are coming from, oops, I went too far.
These trips and the next one.
Okay. And we felt that we needed a more focused program based upon using research as the attraction. So when the students come in the summer, they are picking sort of research areas that have some interest to them. And we actually have them doing significant research in a team on whether it's taking weather observations or it's doing computer modeling of the atmosphere or something like that. And we've actually broadened our approach. It's mostly atmospheric and related sciences, but we also take a comprehensive support system for the students, and we have mentors to help them write their report at the end of the summer. We have people who are helping with any areas that they need sort of an extra boost in terms of science or mathematics or chemistry or whatever. And these students come with undergraduate and graduate support. And they come from meteorology, chemistry, physics now, engineering, mathematics, ecology, and the social sciences. It's important that we start branching out of just sticking to the physical sciences, and that we bring in people who have backgrounds in social sciences. And we've also welcomed lesbian, gay, and bisexual, and transgender, and students with disabilities to join us. And I would say it's been a success. Over 90% of the SOAR students go on to graduate school to obtain masters and PhDs. So that this is really, I think, on the final analysis, have we succeeded? And I think that a number of students that we've had over the years has been somewhere around 250 or something of that sort. And I think most of them, as I travel around to many academic institutions, are on the faculty of institutions, or they're at research centers of one sort or another. And so we're pleased that it works so successfully. Now, oops, yeah, there. On how it's structured is that we pay them a comprehensive wage for coming for the summer. We pay for their housing and travel to and from Boulder, as well as funding them to come to conferences such as the AGU or the American Meteorological Society. And they are also giving some money for undergraduate and graduate education throughout the year. It's really touchy. Thanks to the SOAR's leadership for developing the diversity program that actually works. And I've been talking to other people. Ambrose is one of them, who has a similar sort of program that he'll talk about, I'm sure. But I think it doesn't have to be done exactly in the way that we've done it. I think it's open to sort of picking out various elements of the program that fit your area of science or engineering or whatever. Thank you very much. I'll stop right here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So the way we've designed this session is we will hold questions for the panel portion of our session, which is the second half. So we'd like to invite Aaron Velasco to the stage next. So he's professor of geophysics at UTEP, and we look forward to his talk as well.
Good afternoon. I'm not going to I'm a practicing seismologist. I'm the state seismologist for Texas right now, and so this is my hobby, and it's an important hobby in many respects. And what I would talk to you about is some ideas that I put forth a couple years ago related to diversity in the geosciences and in STEM in general. I'm not going to hopefully take my full amount of time. Where's the?
Oh, here, it's right.
Okay. And first of all, this is a demographics plot, and the whole idea is between the blue and the red has to do with projections of what the racial makeup of our population will be in the United States by 2060, and that those numbers on top of that are percentages. And what you see is that if you look at the Hispanic population in itself, is due to be 31% by 2060, and if you look at the numbers in total, it will be a majority minority population. As many of you already know, that the geosciences is perhaps the least diverse of any field in science. And so, and I've been a practicing seismologist for 25 years. It's been a journey, and we'll hopefully talk about some of that as we move on. But if you want to look at numbers, and so there's some recent papers that came out, and you know, in some respects, there's been a lot more educational literature on diversity or the lack thereof. and some of the things that minorities face. But what I'm going to focus on is something really simple, and that's geography. And if you look at this, this is a makeup of what I've plotted on here. This is the census map for Latinos, and we'll go through a couple of other, we'll go through Native Americans and African American populations. And what's plotted on there is actually the top 50 universities as determined by the U.S. News and World Report. On top of that, they're color-coded. The ones that are yellow circles represent campuses that serve more than 30% Pell Grant recipients. And Pell Grants are actually a measure of underserved student population. They're federal grants given to students that generally are impoverished. If you look at the numbers, 88% of black students receive Pell Grants. 87% of American Indian and Native American students receive Pell Grants. 82% of Hispanics receive Pell Grants. So really, it's a great measure of seeing how diverse some of these institutes are. What's striking about this map is that there's only a few universities. There's 8 universities that serve 50% of the Pell Grant recipients. And actually, most of those are in California. And so those are the UC system. And so kudos to them. The demographics here show you that where the population is for Latinos. If you go to the next slide. This is for Native Americans, and go to the next slide. And this is for African Americans. And what's striking here is none of these top 50 schools are in areas of underserved populations. So go to the next slide. If you look at geoscience populations, it's a little bit different. So I looked at the top 25. Now, there's metrics that we use that I have issues with, but that's beyond the scope of this particular talk. How do we base overall quality? That's one thing that we've got to really look at. But this was basically a top 25 geoscience universities based on overall quality, grad earnings, and major focus. And again, here's the map showing you where the locations of those top 25 geoscience programs are and where the minority populations are. You can slide through. Go to the next one. So this is Hispanic, Native Americans, and also, go back one, African American. And so again, to emphasize that the populations aren't really coincident with the top 25 geoscience programs, the top 50 programs. Go to the next slide. So I took some, next slide, forward. Forward. So this is my simplistic plot. Every one of those is I'm calling it higher education desert. And what you see is that it's clear that where underserved populations reside, there's no access. Now, why is that important? Well, especially I work and live in El Paso. If you look at a lot of the students that aren't from wealth, they are necessarily going to stay home and support the family. Well, if that's the case, then there's no access for these students. They are geography bound, and therefore they are bound to the educational access that they have near them. And so what can be done about this is I think we need to really think about supporting the MSIs in a big way, because they are the ones serving the minority populations. El Paso itself serves 80% Hispanic students. It's on the border. The community is 80% Hispanic. And we also have to define what it means to be serving, and that's another aspect that's a little bit beyond the scope. But again, the major point I want to make is that geography counts, demographics count. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erin. Next, I'd like to invite Chris McEntee to the stage. She's the Executive Director of AGU, and we'll bring up her slides in just a minute.
Okay, just tell me.
This one.
This one, okay. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really delighted to be here presenting, but before I start, I want to thank Billy Williams, our Vice President of Ethics, Diversity, and Inclusion. Billy, stand up, because what I'm presenting really is the culmination of his work with all these amazing speakers and others that you're hearing about today. So I want to start with two stories. I've been at AGU for almost 9.5 years, but when I was called to interview, I thought, well, I'm not a scientist and I'm a woman. So this ought to be really interesting to see how this goes, because I knew about the Earth and space sciences and how undiverse they were at the time. So I thought, well, I'm going to give it my best shot. I'm probably not going to get this job. And lo and behold, I am here 9.5 years later and found that it was a very welcoming and inclusive environment. But the second thing I remember so clearly was several years in, I was still the executive director, but Carol Finn was the president and Margaret Linen was the president-elect, and we were at a council meeting, at this meeting, and the young women in the room were coming up and asking to take our photo. And there were tears in their eyes because they said they never thought they would see their scientific society have 3 women at the leadership helm at one time. So it was a very profound statement that I really hadn't thought about, and that's why I'm so delighted now, at this point in time, to be able to share with you, not only has AGU now kind of fulfilled and is on its way to be that safe, inclusive, and welcoming environment that they always wanted to be and aspired to be, but now they have tools and resources and initiatives underway to actually drive that culture change. And a lot of this is due to Billy and individuals such as the 2 Leslies here and many other people in the room. So what we're working on is cultivating a safe, equitable environment for advancing sciences, and we have 3 interrelated programmatic efforts. One, on how we provide tools and resources for the next generation, cultivating the talent pool, capacity building. The other is a variety of diversity and inclusion programming, like the panel today. And then finally, our Ethics and Equity Center programming. The catalyst to accelerate this work actually started with a workshop in 2016, where there was a lot of public press about harassment in science, where under the auspices of a grant of the National Science Foundation, the AGU convened 65 participants, comprising of academic leaders, scientific society leaders, and government agency reps, and executives from a broad swath of scientific societies. And out of that came a number of actions that AGU then went on to implement along with other partners. One is we updated our ethics policy, which took a very bold step to define harassment as scientific misconduct. We launched our Safe AGU program. You see us all wearing buttons here, and said that anywhere where AGU is a convener or a partner in co-convening, we're going to create a safe environment, and we have a mechanism, if you feel unsafe, to be able to hear your concerns and address them. The next step was we now provide an annual summary to our membership to be transparent about what is happening under our new ethics policy. Are there actions being taken? And if so, are they related to what are considered the conventional definitions of scientific misconduct, such as plagiarism and falsification of results? Or what's the percentage of the complaints that are coming under what we would call more personal conduct or personal behaviors? We've instituted in our honors program and for all our elected leaders, professional conduct as a self-disclosure. And finally, we're doing education and training for all of our AGU elected leaders. We also have established a vision and now resources and actions for diversity and inclusion. The committee is headed by Leslie here. And we really want to be a model organization, and it's cross-cutting across all our programs. We have 5 key goals there, and the advisory committee is overseeing us and making sure that we are going forward and accomplishing our vision. We support our members now with an Ethics and Equity Center. It was formally launched in 2019. It's available through the agu.org web site. There are just a myriad of tools and resources collected from many different leading organizations and leading practices. So it's a collection of resources from the good work of all of you. And so there's tools, there are resources and support, and now we're experimenting with making available to AGU members the opportunity to speak to an outside counsel and get some advice if you're facing, or any members facing, a particular challenging situation in their own home institution. This is not legal representation. This is an advisor who can explore with you or any AGU member what situation are you facing and what options might be available to you. And we have a partnership with the National Center of Professional Research Ethics at the University of Illinois. Recently, to go beyond the scientific community, we actually convened another workshop just this past October with the Rockefeller, supported by the Rockefeller Foundation. And this brought together industry leaders and the corporate sector, along with the leaders in science, to talk about how do we drive a culture change in academia, but throughout science and all the places that it occurs. And we are founding partner of a scientific consortium on sexual harassment in STEM. The other M includes medicine. And 120 societies have joined, and they're actually paying money to join this consortium so that we can have common policies and practices, not the exact wording or exact steps, but common procedures and practices across the scientific universe, scientific society. And we're doing a lot of collaborations. We're having joint sessions with the European Geosciences Union, the Japanese Geoscience Union. We're doing we're a partner in the Advanced Geo Workplace Excellence National Science Foundation grant with the University of Wisconsin and others. We're part of the Talent Pool Bridge program from iGen, and working with AAAS on the Sea Change program, and looking at how we can take that program as a university-wide program and adapt it for actually earth and space science departments within institutions. So this is what we've been able to do, but imagine what we're going to be able to do in the future with this foundation. And so I would encourage each and every one of you, please work with us. And the next time we have a session like this, please bring a colleague with you. Because the more people we have in the room collectively working on this from all across the world, the faster we're going to accelerate the type of safe, welcoming, inclusive environment and diverse environment that we all aspire to for Earth and space science. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chris, and we've all benefited from your leadership over the last 9 years of AGU, and you will be missed. And next, I'd like to invite Professor Heather Hanley up to the stage. So she's Professor of Volcanology and Geochemistry at Macquarie University in Australia, and she's also Director of the Women in Earth and Environmental Sciences in Australia.
Thank you.
So, thank you.
Thanks, it's a real privilege to be here today, so thank you for the invitation. So I thought I'd take a snapshot. We go back. Has it moved? Okay, thanks. So we thought I'd have a look across the Pacific Ocean in Australia and see what the situation is there. And I guess the main message today is that gender is still on the agenda in geosciences in Australia. So this is a snapshot. So this was the first time that gender data was captured by the Australian Research Council in their State of Australian University Research Report, so in 2015. And from that you can see we go from level A down to level E, professor. We've got the males in blue and the females in green. And you can see that the females are underrepresented in all groups, from postdoc at level A to professor level E, but that drop, that typical scissor diagram where we have that transition from, I guess, level C upwards towards professor is extremely significant. So there's obviously a need to increase diversity inclusion across many different, groups, but that gender is still an issue, I guess, globally and particularly in Australia. And we're also driven by the fact that I think everybody here would agree that it increases productivity to have diverse and inclusive workforces, and that's one reason why we're driving this. But the other thing is it's just the right thing to do. Thanks. So solutions, there are obviously a lot of barriers to why women might be underrepresented in geosciences and in STEM in general. These can be things like stereotypes, unconscious bias, can be the lack of role models. So what is the solution to this? And the solution really lies with leadership. So that we take a fix the system approach, so a systemic approach, and not a fix the women approach. So there's a quote here, and this is taken from the Leadership Shadow, which is a collaboration between chief executive women in Australia and the Male Champions of Change. Now, the Male Champions of Change is an initiative where initially 30 chief executive officers, directors, these are male, that got together to try and increase women's representation in leadership levels. So it's also men standing up with women, and it's not just preaching to the converted most of the time. We're actually trying to drive this from everybody's trying to drive this, but they recognize that it comes from leadership. So this is where it needs to be driven, and they've written a model called the Leadership Shadow. So it's the shadow that you cast is what's important. So how you do things, how you address things, how you view culture in your company or your institution is what's really important. And the idea is it starts with us. So the path to lasting performance improvement on any priority starts at the top. It's what you say, how you act, what you prioritize, and how you measure together that determines what gets done or what doesn't. So there have been lots of, now it's great and it's brilliant to hear the initiatives that AGU have taken on this front. But now it's, I guess the leadership levels are really starting to embrace and take on this challenge to address gender inequality and inequity. So there's at the higher education level now, there's the Athena Swan that started in the UK, where now they really want commitment from leadership levels to drive evidence-based information, so lots of survey data, lots of data collected to get a snapshot of what it's like in their environment, in their institution, and then how that can be implemented and associate those changes. So some systemic changes might be to overhaul the promotion model, to create more flexible pathways to promotion and career progression. It could be bringing in flexible work policies. Some of the other examples can be unconscious bias training, and also developing new academic job families, which is what my university have been doing as well through their equivalent Athena Swan, which is the SAGE in Australia. So another way that you can do this is obviously through women-led networks. So there are a number of these in the world. So the EWSN, there's Geo-Latinas, which I think are well represented at AGU here this week. But in Australasia, we realized there was quite a lack of any such network. And it was at a Dorothy Hill Women in Earth Science Symposium, the first one that ran in 2017, that we recognized the need for some sort of network to this front. So myself and another colleague, we co-founded and set up WOMISA. So this is the Women in Earth and Environmental Sciences Australasia Network. We started as Australia, then we had a lot of interest from New Zealand, and then we thought, why don't we go all Australasia and set it up for that. So we launched in March on International Women's Day last year. We've now got over 450 members. It's free to join because we want it to be as inclusive as possible. We have a really good spread, so we have everything from undergraduates, masters, PhD, early career, later career, and we've got members from 11 countries. We've done a number of initiatives so far on minimum, I guess, financial resources, a lot of networking, workshop at conferences, on mentoring, on writing, we've just done, a Shut Up and Write once, and now we're all connected across the country to try and make some writing time. And I guess one of our most significant ones to date would be to create a women in earth and environmental and atmospheric, because we had some interest from atmospheric sciences, a database. So I was recently at a symposium in Australia And there were a number of keynotes. There were 8 keynotes, and only one was female, and she had some relationship to one of the organizers. So afterwards, I asked, there's master's students, there's PhD students here. This is not a very good, you can't be what you can't see. Why don't we have a bit more diversity and gender balance in the speakers? And we were told that there was nobody with that level of expertise that was a woman. So that, of course, infuriated me. And so we set up a database so that we could provide to organizers a list of people looking for particular opportunities, whether it be media, whether it be speaking, whether it be outreach, so that you can, or employment, so you have somewhere to go. So, and I've then since emailed that particular person with a copy of the database, which now has 280 people in. So next one. Yeah, okay. So yeah, just to quickly finish up, I mean, this is all at kind of, I guess, higher education, leadership, it's high level. But what we really need to do is move down to even primary. I have a 2- and a 5-year-old. My 5-year-old, when she was 3, decided she stopped liking green and she'd like pink. Now that to me was a really big problem, just because for me, it was the environment that had told her she'd suddenly realized she's a girl, she's supposed to like pink. So, and you can see it here. So in terms of Australia, we have low amounts of girls electing to take STEM in school. So we're at 27%, which is really low compared to our surrounding. And this is where I believe that change needs to come. It needs to come from, that kind of 3 years upwards. So there are some good initiatives, like now there's some books or Lego that focus on women in research institutes, and Little Miss Inventor. But I think it's going to be a long time before we see Little Miss Volcanologist and Mr. Shared Parental Leave. So thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Heather. Next, I'd like to invite Michelle Cook to the podium from UMass. So she'll be highlighting some unique forums that she's initiated for deaf and hard of hearing academics.
Okay, so suppose that instead of projecting my voice and talking clearly so that you can understand me comfortably, what if I lowered my voice and started talking softer? Maybe you would start having trouble hearing me, and maybe you would wish they had captions here so that you could catch what I'm saying. And maybe you're working hard, and maybe you're imagining that if you had to do this for a long time, you might get really tired. You might be exhausted at the end of the day. And at the end of a week of AGU. Oh my God. All right, so what is it like to have hearing loss in academia? It impacts a wide range of aspects of academia: conferences, panels, committees, faculty meetings, teaching, seminar presentation. And in order to succeed in academia, you need to be able to navigate these kinds of situations and thrive so that you can participate and lead in these situations. And so this is where hearing loss and academia really are a bit at odds with one another. And like the previous speaker spoke out, we don't want to put the problem on the hearing impaired person. What we need to do is fix academia. We need to essentially universal design the way that we do our science. So universal design is being widely applied to classroom settings and in our communities. And the idea is that when our spaces become inclusive our spaces become inclusive for all when we improve access for any subgroups. And an example would be that when we make our events more accessible for deaf and hard of hearing, like having captioning, for example, everyone benefits. English as a second language, people who are distracted, people who, for whatever reason, didn't catch what I had said. So this idea of a universal design we can start to think about for all of academia. So I'm going to tell you a bit about a project that Ana Ciccarelli and I did because we realized that something was missing in our own kind of mentorship in our own academic careers. And this stemmed from 2 problems that we circumscribed. One of the problems was that within universities, the disability services offices are mandated and designed to serve undergraduates. So as professionals with disabilities, we didn't have access to the same resources. And the other thing we noticed is that we were each reinventing the wheel. She had come up with solutions to how she teaches large classes. I had come up with solutions to teaching large classes. And we didn't have any way to crowdsource and compare notes and learn from each other. So what we were missing was a mentoring network. I went backwards. A mentoring network. So we set up this blog, Why the World Needs Another Blog, is what our goal was to build a network of academics with hearing loss from all career stages and fields to share experiences, failures, and potential solutions to our professional challenges. So we started this blog I was going to tell you the name. We get the name The Mind Hears. It comes from a quote by Victor Hugo that says, "What matters deafness of the ear when the mind hears? The only deafness, the true deafness, the incurable deafness is that of the mind." So we've got our website is there if you want to see it. We launched the blog in September of 2018. We've had 21 posts by over 9 authors and over 4,000 views. And I have to say that since launching it, one thing that's really been really impactful is the support of hearing allies out there who read our blog and learn a bit more about some of the challenges we face. But the reason Anna and I do this is our hobby. Once again, it's above our normal teaching service and outreach, teaching service and research job. The reason we do this in our spare time is we want to reach out to other people with deafness. So we've been able to do that in an effective way. So I wanted to transition now. So this is one example of setting up a new mutual mentoring network, particularly for deaf and hard of hearing academics. But the same idea can be transported more broadly to disabled academics as well. So I wanted to take a moment to show you some statistics about disabled geoscientists. Where we look at the working adult population, about 20% of the working adult population in the US has disabilities. When we look at undergraduate, that number drops, but we see about 11 to 13% of undergraduates have disabilities. And then when we move to graduate school, about 7 to 8 master's and PhD students. All right, well, here it gets even worse. That's in all fields. So the orange boxes are all fields. Geosciences in the last few years has graduated. Only 2% of the PhD earners have been from geosciences. No, 2% of the PhDs earned in geoscience have had disabilities. There we go. So there's a cliff. Geosciences is at the bottom of the barrel when it comes to percentage of PhDs earned by people with disabilities. I think there's only one field that's below us. We're below engineering. We're below all of the other physical sciences. And when we project that into job outcomes, people aged 30 to 39, so that's post-PhD, early career kind of setting. If you have a disability, if you have a PhD and you have a disability, you're 4 times more likely to be looking for a job than if you are able-bodied. So that this cliff just kind of continues down the way. So one of the reasons for this is the lack of support as we go through academia. Undergraduates, we're making good strides. I'm not going to say that we're done, but we're making really good strides with disability services. The AGDD is doing really important work in terms of improving pedagogy and improving access to field trips. But when we move on to graduate students and professionals with disabilities and their support, we're seeing a lot less. ADA's Americans with Disabilities Act. And so I feel there's a need for more improved networks for disabled academics. Once again, this kind of model from the mind here that we can share successes and compare notes on what works and what doesn't. And so I want to end with a couple sort of takeaway points on universal design, ableism, and disability gain. I wanted to reiterate that our spaces become more inclusive for all when we improve access for any subgroup. And then a couple quotes on these different ideas. What we say and do when we assume there's no people with disabilities present can perpetuate an exclusive nature. So we should never be presuming that everyone in our audience, everyone in our class is able-bodied. By doing so, we're basically taking an ableist view. And then the last quote is, our disabilities have made us better scientists, from a recent blog. There's this idea that by not including disabled scientists, we're missing out on their brilliance, obviously, but also their different perspectives that could help us solve problems more effectively. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Very much appreciated. It's my pleasure to invite Ardhana Tripodi to the stage now. She's a professor at UCLA, and she's tackling just the systemic change that we certainly all need to make in order to better support professional advancement.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Ardhana Tripodi, and as a means of introduction, my pronouns are she, they, and my family are immigrants from the Fiji Islands with ancestry from India, due to both having been colonies of Britain. I want to begin with a land acknowledgement that we're meeting on the unceded lands of the Ohlone peoples. With this, I also want to acknowledge that people from indigenous groups and from other marginalized groups, as we've been hearing, face enormous barriers in geoscience and environmental science, as well as other STEM fields, and more broadly in society. Today, I'm going to talk about work that we're doing at UCLA to incentivize, activate, and support networks of faculty and students in order to reduce these barriers. Now, this is based on the work we've been doing collaboratively at our Center for Diverse Leadership in Science, where we have geoscientists and social scientists, faculty and students and staff, interacting over the last several years to shape a vision together for healthier spaces on campus. Now, this began about 10 years ago when I arrived at UCLA and has grown from there thanks to the support of the National Science Foundation, who through a career award supported a pilot that has over 90% retention rates. We believe this work that we're doing is important not just to change the geosciences, but also to impact a range of institutions and communities that we are part of in society. Now, as my colleagues in education often discuss, people that we interact with in higher education institutions are at a very powerful time of their socialization when they come to engage with us. This ends up shaping their norms and behaviors. So what we do in the classroom, in the field, and on our campuses ends up having a whole cascade of impacts. And essentially, our students end up becoming exposed to people who not only serve as their role models, they also meet their peers and form relationships that create lifelong networks. Now, please raise your hand if any of you have seen this study by Rachel Barnard and Emily Cooperdock. Great. Looks like not everybody has, and so I just want to point out that this study looked at racial diversity amongst PhDs in the geosciences in this country over 40 years using NSF data. Now, Rachel's an assistant professor, mantle geochemist, and geodynamicist who is the 23rd African-American woman in this country to receive a PhD in geosciences. And that only recently happened. This is even though, since the 1970s, more than 10,000 people who are white have gotten PhDs in the area. Now, I looked at the data at an undergraduate level, and I see that there are similarly distressing numbers, which I show up here. And this is despite the demographic trends that the US has experienced. And other fields are doing much better, so we are the dinosaurs. In fact, Congress is diversifying faster than geoscience leadership is. And so let me just ask you another question. Raise your hand if you're a fan of white supremacy, of toxic masculinity. Then why is it that we stand for this? In fact, it's been more than half a century after the Civil Rights Act, and we need to collectively take responsibility because it is our collective actions and inactions in the geosciences that means that these are the numbers that we have. And I want to also highlight that this problem reflects a history of racism and other forms of exclusion and violence, and the structural and cultural legacy this has left in higher education. Now, if we want to take a look at the different ways that leadership can be expressed in higher education, we can look at the different settings that we interact with each other within this broader ecological framework, where we have different types of interactions. So what you can see is that we have interactions as part of groups, as part of the classrooms, labs, meetings, social settings with colleagues. And so with these activities, we are constantly socially constructing either oppression or inclusion through our behaviors. I also want to highlight that resistance to oppression can always take place, that this can happen at all levels of the higher education system. And as many social scientists have shown, if you're not actively doing this work, then you're actually actively contributing to the problem, whether or not you're aware of it. So from decisions that we take about the curricula that we use, the codes of conduct we have for research environments and conferences, to speaking up in our labs or at faculty meetings, to even who you choose to collaborate with, all these things we are impacting one another. So the framework that we use emphasizes that organizational level change cannot occur without individual efforts. It also recognizes that with enough individual acts, you can create a culture and readiness for systemic change to support inclusive climates in the geosciences. Now, in practice, the way that we do this is through an ecosystem of fellowship programs and an associated set of commitments for our fellows. We intentionally create communities of learning and practice, and through the structure of our center, we're focused on nurturing mindsets and awareness in our fellows. We value and reward action and practices, and our goal is long-term systemic change through inclusive practices in the areas that are shown in the lower right of the figure. So in doing our work, we serve to network people and empower them as agents of change so that they can speak up and act to shape norms and internalize skills that relate to inclusion on the right-hand side of the spectrum in order to tip the scales in the geoscience. I also want to highlight that our work is grounded in literature from Black feminists and educators that are focused on engaged pedagogy. So our center is really an umbrella that uses resources in order to incentivize faculty and students to use on-campus and off-campus resources that are otherwise not very widely used. We're in the process of planning a program of honorary fellows from other academic and non-academic institutions that include community organizers, Indigenous leaders, as a positive disruption to higher ed culture. What we have with our existing faculty fellows program is something that actually has a pretty high completion rate just in the last year and a half, where about 50% of our faculty fellows have completed 20 to 50 hours of training together and begun to put what they've learned into practice. And they do this to create collaborative, inclusive environments in the research lab, in the classroom, and in their departments. Some of the training that they do includes multiple models for community-engaged teaching, confronting bias, learning about mentoring practices. So finally, I want to highlight that in the past 3 years, we've supported 100 early career fellows. And some examples of the work that they've done is actually highlighted in the 3 posters and talks that are shown in the upper right. Our early career fellows have been supported through the recognition that we provide, financial support, mentoring, social belonging events, and the cohort building that we do to ensure many of their fundamental needs are met in higher education settings. We focus on higher and technical skills development and then opportunities for people to put what they're learning into practice through service learning and through research in supportive settings. Through our early career fellows, community outreach, and the work that I've done, over the last year, we reached more than 2,400 people. So that's the type of impact that these 100 folks can have just by being activated. And I show examples of their community-led engagement programs and collaborative research projects, as well as some of the demographic data that we have. We have a presentation, I believe tomorrow, where there's a poster that shows some more of our results if you're interested in learning more. Thank you.
Thank you, Ardhana. It's been remarkable what you've been able to achieve in the short time in your center. It's my pleasure to welcome Ambrose Gerald to the stage from the National Technical Association. I also had a long history he did at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and we're pleased you could join us.
Thank you, Lisa, and good afternoon. I want to preface what I have to a little bit share with you about a program in Woods Hole with the fact that, at least from my perspective, we're celebrating, that is AGU, the centennial, the 100 years, and that's here in America. I'm speaking of as far as 35 years of that was doing segregation. And so we are now in a post-segregated era. And the Brown versus Board of Education, which basically lifted the veil of segregation, that is, that removed the obstacle of whites and non-whites being able to sit next to each other in a classroom, as well as all the other amenities that society would offer, whether it was housing, lodging, travel, etc. So I want to say that that is important because we're looking at 100 years of an organization, and the organization that I represent, the National Technical Association, is in its 94th year. But a good portion of that parallel existence was in a segregated society. And so I think it's important for us not to forget our past as we continue to try to forward the future. And so in doing that, I think one other aspect that I think that we, at least again personally, I think we might want to keep in mind is that when we are looking at education in this country that impacts both the educational and the occupational realities, that we are still in many ways here dealing with a dual education system. It's hidden, but it is not absent. And while we are post-segregated, there is still ad hoc segregation that is going on in the U.S. that impacts the success or the access of young people to education, which then would propel them to perhaps have, productive futures. Sorry, let's get here. Woods Hole, where I worked for 39 years for the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration. Some of you may have heard of it as a little village where big science goes on. And as here we can see, or I want to express, is that a lot goes on there. It's quite diverse in terms of the science or the engineering or development. And there are diverse institutions that includes both private and public institutions. And so the demographics there in Woods Hole is predominantly white. As far as the workforce is concerned, at all 6 institutions, there's probably not more than 2 to 3% people that are non-white that are employed in Woods Hole. The education or the training is a bit better, but it's seasonal, where people come in the summer. And we have what is called the Partnership Education Program, which I directed for a number of years. I got started in 2009. And you can see the statistics here. And I know I have a little bit of time, so I'm not going to go through all of that. But this gives you a snapshot of what in 10 years we've been able to do among the 6 institutions working together with an academic partner, the University of Maryland, Eastern Shore. The National Technical Association, as I said, is in its 94th year. And the organization has had a lead for some time in the, at least the African American, the Black community. But it too now is diverse, and so it came about when we could not go to any other organization, scientific or otherwise, to practice our profession or seek our, or support our interests. And so, but those partnerships, the partnerships between the Woods Hole institutions, the National Technical Association, and I would say the National Science Foundation, which has supported a series of workshops over the years in geosciences, has been key to moving forward to make sure that we're at the table, so to say. And recently we had a workshop that was focused on optimizing the internship experience. And you can see here there was quite a mix of people who attended. But I think the main thing about that, from my point of view, is that we were able to bring together 4 REU programs sponsored by the National Science Foundation, along with that are at predominantly minority-serving institutions, along with the other institutions, PWIs, and it was a rich exchange. And Kevin Chu tomorrow is giving a talk, and he will go into more detail about what we found at that workshop. But the upshot is that it was a very positive outcome in the sense that we have brought programs together with mutual interests to try to address the issue of diversity and inclusion. And that experience, again, not to go through all of this, but essentially what we found is there are some good things happening in each of those programs. They were very nurturing programs, but it was exceedingly, I think, arresting in many ways to hear what the alums of those 9 programs had to say. And in addition to the program leaders coming to Woods Hole, we invited X number of alums from each of those programs that are now at various levels in their career trace. And I would say that one of the things, this last bullet here, certainly is that it would be do well for all of us to collaborate and share best practices, supporting our individual efforts. And I think that was one of the certainly key things that came out of that. And as far as looking forward is concerned, as I said, it included public and private institutions that included the NSF and NTA, and that the national collaboration would be strengthened by increased partnership with professional organizations, including perhaps led by AGU. I know AGU is doing a lot. I've been involved now with AGU for over 20 years. And so, but I would say that a lot of what AGU has been doing has been in the last 25 years or so, and has heightened more recently. So the role for a professional organization, my opinion, is to promote data collection and dissemination, provide forums for exchange of ideas, participate or experiment, that is, test new ideas for promoting diversity and inclusion, and hosting discussions of uncomfortable or inconvenient facts about the national effort to increase diversity and inclusion. And for instance, does a rising tide really lift all boats? Or does the diversity and inclusion effort leave some groups stranded? And I think this is what we have to continue to own up to and to wrestle with. It doesn't mean that we aren't doing good things, we don't have good intentions and want to do good things, but I believe we have to wrestle with still this inequity that does exist in higher education, in employment, and in education in general. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank all the speakers and certainly all of you in our audience who are able to be here, and we encourage you to stay. So even though we ran a little bit over on the talks, we have until 3:40 for some questions that the panelists will answer. Our speakers will serve as panelists now, and then we'll also have time for some open Q&A. So I'd like to invite our presenters up, and we'll have a series of questions for them. So it's a little tight up here, but make yourselves comfortable, and so that the audience can hear us, we'll need to pass the mic. I don't know if this one comes, well, yeah, but here on the stage, when our panelists are answering, we'll have them use the mic, but I don't know that I can move this one. Okay. So there were some questions that I circulated. Does that pass down that mic? Okay, yeah. Okay, thank you. So I prepared a few questions for the panelists. We may not get through them all. Perhaps with the first question, we'll start from our left we'll just go down left in the row and ask each of you to answer. And then the subsequent questions we can pick and choose, or some are ideally suited for a number of you. But as you can certainly understand from all that was shared from these experienced scientists, that there are many ways in which, through their own work and life, they're making progress and certainly elevating the importance of diversity and inclusion in the earth and space sciences, so within their own careers. And a number of our speakers did touch on areas where they do feel we have made significant progress, but certainly, as we know, as a community, there are areas most in need of improvement still. So with that in mind, if each speaker could really focus on those two things. So what do you feel in your own professional experiences and in the work that you do that you've made the most progress, or the people around you maybe have progressed in their thinking, but what are some areas in which you feel we're still in need of improvement as a community trying to move the needle on diversity and inclusion? So, there you go.
Thank you. I think what I've seen over the last almost 30 years in higher education is that there's been a huge emphasis made on recruitment, and it's been very heartwarming to see how effective many programs have been, but we've not been terribly effective with respect to retention. The gains that have been made have primarily been ones relating to the experiences of white women in the geosciences, and much less so when thinking about the experience of women of color, queer women, trans women, disabled women, and so forth. I would, in terms of an area for growth, in addition to that, I think having the same type of emphasis on issues relating to racial harassment, as well as disability access, I think are critical.
Great.
I think one huge improvement is we're having this conversation, right? So, yeah, that's definitely an improvement. I think in terms of disabilities, one advance that we could make strides in geoscience is to shift our viewpoint of disability. So there's what we call the medical model of disability, which focuses on what's broken in the person, and then there's the cultural model of disability, which is rather thinking of disability more holistically and what that person brings to the table. And I think as geoscientists, we tend towards viewing things as a medical model, and the more we can sort of shift and think about disabilities in a cultural context, that will benefit all of our community.
Well, I think that everyone understands that we need to get more people into the pipeline. So this means that sometimes we'll have to reach down to the high school level, because if the students don't have the background who go into engineering or chemistry or mathematics or physics, then they're going to have a hard time succeeding in the geosciences. So I think that we can find ways to sort of reach down and help those institutions. Then it'll increase the number of people in the pipeline.
I'm in the middle here. Yeah, so I guess from a gender perspective, I think the challenges that we're facing, women, say, 30 years ago are very different from the challenges that we're probably facing today. So before it was just a challenge to get into the room and probably be the only woman in the room, whereas today I think it's a lot more subtle what some of those challenges are, and a lot to do with unconscious bias. So I think, yeah, I guess raising awareness through recruitment, and also doing things like, I mean, nobody wants to be part of a quota for a woman today, you know, so we've gone from getting women in the system and now it's, you know, trying to get equality in that system, and I don't think people are keen to be a quota, you know, you want to be there by merit, so it's about cultivating those pools. So for example, it might be, you know, going out and finding the women that you can invite to apply for that position, being a bit more proactive, so that actually those women are getting jobs or opportunities based on merit, but not because you want so many women to be part of the panel or the department. So I think that's where it's probably changed to now.
From my perspective, I think the advancement for me has been the literature that's been out there regarding understanding the experiences I've had. For example, understanding what imposter syndrome is, or microaggression, or all these different things that we've probably all experienced. Certainly I didn't understand it, and nor did I even identify some of that. But now I can, because it's actually there, out there. The things that we haven't really moved the needle. That's the thing that, especially in my field, a student approached me at a conference at SOCNAS just recently and said that I was the first Latino geophysicist she'd ever met as a faculty member. And so that tells you that I haven't always been a faculty member. I was in industry for a while, but the last 19 years I have been. And so we just haven't moved that needle. And in some respects, there isn't a critical mass that we have that we can really move that needle forward. And I'm talking specifically with racial minorities in the geosciences.
In terms of progress and my experience and where I see there's been progress, I'll just focus on Woods Hole. And the progress that I see there, and I'm hoping it's progress and not an illusion, is that I do see that there appears to be an intentionality to seriously address diversity, inclusion, and equity in Woods Hole. The 39 years that I worked there, that certainly, I wouldn't have said that was the case, and it certainly wasn't the case when I arrived there and in the first years. And so to me, that's progress, and I think that has a lot to do with the young people today who are not from the old world thinking, so to say, and they don't seem to be afraid of diversity, inclusion, and equity. And I think the young people are driving or pushing the leadership to maybe perhaps finally have some character and actually do something intentionally to change the institutions and their perspective and welcoming of diversity, inclusion, and equity. As far as where improvement still needs to be had, I think there's certainly miles to go. Woods Hole is a predominantly white space, and so they need to certainly, with all of this newfound or evolved dedication to really, as part of the solution, the need to find a way to bring in people in good paying jobs with quality, with benefits that look very different from who have the jobs with very nice benefits right now.
Pass the mic, thank you. It's very clear when we began talking about progress we have made, but what still becomes an ongoing challenge, that so many of the things that limit the progress are rooted in the culture of academia and in the often lack of leadership. And so these next couple of questions are about that, just trying to drill down to what are some ways we can be more effective at promoting changes in academic culture. And I certainly know from your work, Ardhana, at your institute, that really working with early career individuals and others to not have to accept, what's often been the structure of most academic institutions. So just reading from the question, academic culture is often seen as a chief barrier to meaningful change in diversity in the geosciences. So what are some ways you, our panelists, think we could be more effective at promoting changes in academic culture to remove barriers and disincentives for increasing diversity, not only among the faculty and professional populations at the academy, but certainly with students as well. So we'll go in order again, and then we can mix it up the next time. Okay.
So I think that having these conversations, as was pointed out earlier, is actually a really critical tool for activating people and broadening their awareness of there being agents of culture. We had a discussion earlier that was facilitated by Professor Kendall Moore at the University of Rhode Island, where she's been screening a series of documentaries that she's made about the experiences that people of color in STEM have, and the discussions that are facilitated by her and Catalina Martinez have really been impactful at growing awareness. Last year at AGU, Julie Posey, a professor at USC who's a social scientist, she talked about levers of cultural change in higher ed, and so she talked about professionalization processes, things like trainings, workshops, supporting opportunities for translating learning to practice, expectations of resource providers like AGU, NSF, NASA, as just some of the examples.
Yeah, I would echo that. I would also point out, a lot of us are doing this as extra, above and beyond what our job descriptions are. So if there were ways to sort of bake into our job description some of these elements that we're moving forward and taking leadership in, that can incentivize more action.
Actually, there's a lot of ways you can do things to help out. I've already established two scholarships. I'm working on a third now to make an individual effort and to trying to attract underrepresented minorities and others into the sciences. I just think that I really have to show, or I think it's important to sort of show even personal ways of dealing with this problem. Thank you.
Yeah, so I guess I just wanted to highlight one particular aspect, in changing academic culture, and that's stimulating conversations about casual sexism in geosciences. And a really good example of this that's been led by some early career researchers is a website called didthisreallyhappen.net. And what they do through comic strips is they showcase real events that have happened and real experiences that that women have had where they exemplify casual sexism. So it can be at a conference, it could be mainly at meetings. It might be one person meeting another, and the first question they ask a woman is, "Who's your supervisor?" As if you're going to get judged, entirely on. So it's these little things that the person that might be saying that is not really aware that it might be an issue or it's offensive or there's a problem. So it's didthisreallyhappen.net. And it's just a really good way, I think, to exemplify to everyone, to give the confidence to, say, PhD, early career, younger researchers that are coming into a culture where you still have, I guess, some of this aspect there, that this is not acceptable and this is not how it's supposed to be, and speak up if so. And it also then highlights to people who are not fully aware of what they're, they don't intend to offend or upset anyone, but it also shows them, or makes them ask a question. So there's something not right with what I've just said, so what is that? So I think it's just a really nice way, to do it in a, I guess, constructive way to highlight and raise awareness to everyone what acceptable. It's like a code of conduct, but it's, highlighting casual sexism in geosciences. Thanks.
Not to be cynical, but retirement?
Yeah, I get some people.
And my comment is based on, if in the academic community, I've been fortunate that I've had experience outside. So, but senior faculty control the future, and they really shouldn't in many respects. So they control what's rewarded. They control, what a lot of different aspects. Junior scientists, a lot of them have different interests that should be fostered, not be scorned if they want to go volunteer for certain things and say, no, you need to be in the lab, you need to be working. And so if you look at that aspect, it's not just the faculty, it's the management, and that is you change the reward system. If you really want something, the reward system has to be changed. Academic environments are very much about empire building, right? And everyone, and hopefully I don't offend anyone, but you build this little empire on something that's probably not that important, and so it's important to you, but really, if you think about bigger picture, it's great. Academic jobs, you get to do what you want, as long as you're bringing funding, that's great. But empire building is exclusionary also, and so it's non-inclusive. So that environment itself, is not being rewarded, but to try to break those down. To try to bring in even interdisciplinary work is not rewarded. To try to do these sort of events where you're reaching out to the community in different aspects is not rewarded. And so those that are passionate, that are here trying to make that change, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's valued anymore at my institution. And I think that sort of thing, I'm okay with that, but the point is, if you want to make dramatic changes throughout, people have to be rewarded for those kind of efforts.
I mentioned that there's this invisible two academic or educational tracks here in this country. And part of that has to do with the establishment under segregation of the tribal colleges, of the historically black colleges and universities, and the Latino and Asian and access to education. And so one of the things that the National Technical Association has been focusing on is, given that we have the historically black colleges and universities and other directed institutions around culture or ethnicity, is that with regards to geosciences, as I mentioned, we've partnered with the National Science Foundation Geoscience Directorate to focus as much as we can on looking at what a framework for geosciences looks like in the HBCUs, for example, and what it looks like outside of the HBCUs, and how do we crosswalk between the HBCUs and the previously white institutions, or predominantly white institutions, in terms of shared resources. How do we find ways to look at the resources and how to address capacity building in the HBCUs with regards to what they can offer in terms of their curriculum around geosciences, but also to provide capacity building in the previously white institutions or predominantly white institutions that are very good at what they do with the resources they have had, but they haven't been very good at producing individuals with credentials from underrepresented backgrounds.
Thank you. You know, given the richness of everyone's answers to those questions and the remarks that we heard from all the speakers in their prepared presentations, although I still have a number of questions that I can ask or will hope to get to, I'd actually like to open up the floor now because there are likely to be a number of questions that you all have or things that were on your mind that maybe brought you here to our session. And we have all these wonderful experts here, and I'm sure they'd be willing to share more words of advice, antidotes, their own experiences. So if anyone has questions, we'd ask that you use the mic. My fellow conveners, if you all have questions too, or other members of our committee that are here, but yes, feel free to ask the panelists questions. And identify yourself, please. Ooh, sorry.
Hi, I'm Emily Cooperdock. I am a new assistant professor at University of Southern California. And so I am teaching an intro grad course required for every first-year earth science grad student, PhD students at USC. It just talks about how to be a successful grad student. And I've decided to introduce one of our meetings will be to discuss diversity and inclusion issues in the geosciences. And what I realized my first attempt at it this year is that was a really challenging discussion to lead with a very international group of first-year PhD students. And I kind of went into it with the idea that, oh, I've thought about this. I'm thinking about it all the time. Let's just start this conversation and have it roll. And it ended up being a very kind of polarizing session where half the students thought, if you had to cut one, maybe cut that one. And half the students said, thank you so much for including this. You know, this is really great. So my question and my advice that I'm asking is, you know, maybe it would be useful if there was some sort of training or curriculum that could be provided to professors who want to introduce these topics in their grad level education, and what could you imagine that might look like?
Yeah, let's do it. I don't have an articulate response. I also teach a seminar for first-year grad students. I see that as an incredible foundation in which to establish what we value as academics, right? Exactly. So we have to have that conversation. It's what we value. And I don't cut it from your curriculum.
Oh, no, I'm not cutting it, for the record.
Yeah, I'd be curious.
But I want to improve it, yeah.
Yeah, how do we make that go forward, and how do we share the different things that we might be doing at different institutions so that we can compare notes?
Yeah, so two things come to my mind. The first thing is actually think about things like this film that I mentioned earlier, Can We Talk, or these films, Can We Talk and Can We Talk Too, and the facilitated discussions that are associated with that. I think that's actually something that is very structured, and there are people who bring an enormous amount of training and lived experience and practice with utilizing it as a tool for growth and catalyzing action. So that could be a wonderful opportunity. So connect with Kendall Moore, who's at the University of Rhode Island. And then the second thing is that there are a number of social scientists, from people who are social psychologists, Julie Pousset, who's at USC, and so inviting one of them in to facilitate the discussion, because they really have those tools, and you can learn from that, right, and do it even more effectively than hopefully the next time. The polarization that you described in your class, though, that also reminds me a little bit of what we see at a national scale and what we've historically had in this country, so maybe we should also temper our expectations for what will come out of one discussion and think about a whole series of structured interventions to, meet different people where they're at and catalyze growth of different people given their awareness.
And I guess, I was just thinking to try and engage everyone, then whether you could develop some sort of activities based around unconscious bias, so, where they can actually figure out if they have, there are these kind of tests, the Harvard tests and things, but maybe something a bit more interactive, but it would highlight their unconscious bias and actually then make them start to think, actually, this is relevant to me because I have this, I have this bias, and it might kind of open their eyes a little bit, maybe.
Great. Next question.
Thanks. My name is Kevin Chu, and Dr. Gerald mentioned that I was at the same workshop that he was at. Dr. Cooperdock, I think, raised the same kind of question that I'm thinking about. From that workshop, which was a remarkable gathering, one of the key messages that came out was that we need to get the leadership of the predominantly white organizations involved and really engaged. They have to stand up and say, this is, my institution is not going to be racist. We will be a welcoming institution. And I've been thinking about how to do that, and it is this kind of conversation that we need to have with the leadership. They needed to come to hear those articulate, heartfelt stories from the former interns who were at the Dr. Gerald's workshop about how uncomfortable they felt on campus, despite the fact that their internships were extremely valuable, sometimes life-changing. They felt uncomfortable on the predominantly white campuses, and the best way to turn the leadership around is for them to hear those stories and say, yeah, I don't want that to happen. But those conversations are really dangerous. They're very, very difficult, and I've been trying to think how to do it because most of us are not trained in how to guide a conversation that feels safe from all perspectives. And I'd like the panel to think about or provide me with guidance on how do you create a safe space so that the students who have experienced discrimination on a predominantly white campus can say, honestly, this is how I felt, without worrying that that will reflect on their future career prospects or their future employment prospects. And the people who need to hear it, the heads of the institution can listen to them and say, I hear them and I want this person not to feel that way anymore, rather than feeling defensive and saying, well, that person didn't think about this aspect, or they don't really understand all of the pressures that are on me. So if you can please, I'm sorry going on this, but it's been on my mind. If you can please provide any guidance on how do we ensure a safe conversation for all sides. Thank you.
Thank you. Who wants to tackle that one first? So, Erin.
It's a difficult question to answer, but I guess one thing in terms of making a safe environment is you can utilize social media, so you can actually have situations where people have an anonymous profile, so everyone could be included who you wanted to be included, but no one's identified, and share information or stories or so I'm trying to think about that situation that might be a safe environment. So I know in terms of, I actually saw it was done through a documentary, and it was about, I think it was called the 31st of August, and it was focused in an Asian country where on the 31st of August there's an increase in suicide rates from high school students not wanting to go back to school. So it was a documentary producer decided they're going to tackle this. They were actually, and they had it where it was, it was this open, it was actually like a TV show, and there was all these, everyone had an avatar or something, and all these things come up the screen, and they had, I guess, counselors and people talking through. But they've made it in the public. They brought it, everybody then shared, oh, you feel that way too. They had people that had gone through situations and been successful. So I don't know if we can adopt some kind of approach in the same way, but I don't know how you can create, you know, a safe space where they feel free to communicate, but also can reach the right people, because a report's just not going to, I don't think it's going to do it. Thanks.
So I think there's two avenues. One of them is that student-driven sort of groups have been very, very effective. And in fact, the SOCNAS, which is the Society for Advancement of Chicanos and Native Americans in Science, it creates a safe space for many students to attend a conference and to celebrate not only the science they're doing, but who they are. And I think that, and so for many of you that have attended, have seen that. And by doing so, especially the students that feel very isolated in these predominantly white institutions, they feel like SOCNAS is home. And I certainly felt that way when I was at Santa Cruz, and Lisa White and I were both colleagues at Santa Cruz, and you know, the numbers haven't changed there. We go to reception, and that's really still there. The other side, as far as institution, that's driven by leadership. And you know, until you get a leader that really, really embraces that, you can see dramatic change, and that leadership has to be in place for many years, and UTEP is a prime example of that. And so we had a leader that was really driven to changing a university that was on the border to serve the community. It took 30 years, but we finally got those numbers to reflect the demographics of El Paso to the demographics of the university. So those aren't easy solutions. The way university systems work and presidents are, they cycle through. It's very hard to see that sort of sustained mission. Now that I'm really happy to say that mission is not going to change for El Paso, I think, no matter any president that comes through, because we have so much momentum on our side regarding that. So, you know, there's a student side that students can really embrace each other and help serve as support groups. And then there's the other side trying to get leadership to really buy into this, and that's a much harder problem.
I want to express my support for what my colleagues have just said, and to also acknowledge that these stories have been shared. There are so many stories that are actually out there, and feel free to reach out, and happy to share some of those with you. Those stories exist in terms of statistics, but also in terms of case studies, anecdotes, anonymous surveys, climate assessments, and so forth. So you don't need to put your students at your institution through the trauma of sharing those stories, per se. There's a lot of storytelling that exists. There is a function for storytelling as a form of medicine for the students that are going through trauma at the time, but that is not in a venue where they're talking to administrators, right? And finally, on the administration side of things, I guess I look at the history that Ambrose talked about, that Warren has talked about, and I see something a little bit different. You know, I see that we have a long ways to go. There are very few historically white institutions in this country where we have enlightened leadership. You know, Arizona State University, you know, we have a series of community colleges, and yeah, anyways, UCLA is, for example, not a place where I would say that that's the case, where we have such enlightened leadership. And so we have the kind of top-down approach for thinking about change, and that's really the ideal, but we don't have that, right? And again, we don't see that happening right now in our country. So how does change occur? We have to think about bottoms-up approaches, how we empower people at a range of levels. And one of the really effective tools that student activists have utilized have been the shaming, right, that occurs. So Christina Larson, who's this advocate that works with AGU, thanks to Billy Williams and Chris McEntee's leadership, they'd mentioned, she says to me, university administrators, they don't see the light, they feel the heat. And so Brown versus Board of Education happened because of courageous people. And then you go to this museum in Montgomery County that looks at the history of racism in this country, you see that there were so many activists working in the educational space for generations, and that represented a culmination of that work. As Ambrose pointed out, we still see that in education. We still see this expressed in employment. And so we have to look at activism, I think, on that legal side and the community organizing side, the sharing of embarrassing stories, perhaps, in news outlets and so forth. And those are the things that might help to drive cultural change.
Sure, one more comment, and then I know there's
I know
more
we,
questions.
I know we have other questions, but just briefly, I would say, with regards to safe space, the change that I've seen in Woods Hole came about because over the 10 years, the diversity initiative, which was made up of the leadership of the 6 scientific institutions there, and its working arm was something called the Diversity Advisory Committee, which I chaired for 9 years. And so I would say how we created a safe space there was, it was just good old-fashioned manners in assuring the other that when he or she spoke, that nobody was going to come down on them, like accusing them or whatever. And over time, through my faithfully bringing donuts and coffee to each meeting, we got to a place where people could kick back and really have an in-depth conversation, whether it was about racism, sexism, you name it. But it took just respecting the other. And so I think we just have to remember, when we talk about safe spaces, it has to do with manners.
Great, well, the next question?
Hi, my name is T. Trong. I'm a PhD student in geology at Oregon State University, and I have a question regarding conversations about race. Particularly, has anyone on the panel had luck in discussing how international students, whether they be undergraduates or graduate students, don't necessarily represent progress and diversity?
Aaron, you want to start with that one?
That's been much more individualistic for me. I've had that conversation. I think that's something that's important to recognize, that the experiences of both populations, not to invalidate them, but they are different. And so I think that's, and a lot of graduate programs have, some of them have, majority international students. And so there's different needs there that need to be addressed. At the same time, the conversation has to be about what the needs, especially those students that feel isolated. I'd like to share the story. I'm really good friends with a colleague of mine that grew up in rural Pennsylvania. And the reason why we're really good, he's white, is that we had both similar backgrounds. And in similar backgrounds in the sense of coming from impoverished communities that education access was an issue. So there's a lot more similarities that we need to be looking at amongst those populations also. And so, even though we want to say it's racial, it's really socioeconomic. And so, many international students, come to the U.S. to get great education because we have a great system, and yet a lot of them come from more privileged backgrounds than a lot of the students that are coming from the inner cities. And so there is a difference there, but we can't necessarily, like I said, we don't want to weight one or the other. And I think that shared experience by having those international students it's been wonderful for lots of different reasons. And so I think the support for the minorities in the graduate programs is just not there. That's my assessment. And so I think that that's been the challenge.
I'll just add by saying that as a diversity and inclusion committee at AGU, this topic has come up often, and even when we look and examine the definition of diversity and what it means within a big professional society like AGU, where clearly so many members are international, we've often had to just rethink how we describe ourselves as a community. And having spent many years before I came to Berkeley in my current role, the Museum of Paleontology, I was professor of geosciences at San Francisco State University. And I'm also active in an organization, the National Association of Black Geoscientists. And there's actually more Black scientists that are either from the Caribbean or from Africa in that organization. And I wouldn't say it causes a lot of tension. It's just there are different experiences. We don't always have the shared background. And the last thing we want to do is pit people, students or professionals, against one another. So it's important to have discussions, lay ground rules if you have to. This is where leadership comes in a department. And it's often leadership in either societies or departments that make us feel like we have to battle for, a place and definition. So I think it's important as we begin to have even more discussions about diversity and inclusion that the role of international students and professionals be prominent in that discussion.
Thank you.
Thanks. So I do want to be sure we have time for your question.
I'll be quick about my question, but my name is Rachel Hampton, and I'm currently a PhD student at the University of Oregon. And I just wanted to first thank you all for having this conversation. As a woman who has a spinal cord disability, I think just even having people recognize this turns something that's invisible into something that's very visible. And I think that's really important. And so one thing we've tried to do at the University of Oregon, myself and a few of my colleagues, have been to make a group in our department that focuses on just helping the people in our department. So it really tries to focus on giving skills to the underrepresented groups just in our department. And one thing that I was sort of wondering that you've kind of hinted at is what are the role, kind of as you see it, of local sort of efforts versus sort of these national efforts that are kind of ongoing as well. So if you could sort of, speak to that, that'd be great.
I'm not sure I have a good answer. I'm from Oregon, too. But I think the thing is that we need to kind of still use universities and colleges and so forth as a place where we learn about other cultures. And I think that's a learning process, that having a perspective of different experiences and sharing them, I think will actually help smooth things over and make things more understanding just from having different experiences.
I think one thing that I'd like to say to that is that all experiences that we have are inherently, they're local experiences that we have in our local environment. And so, and as Erin spoke earlier, geography matters, demographics matters. So I think it is really important to think about the interventions that one has in that local context. But I also think that in terms of movement building with respect to inclusion in higher education and geosciences, it's really important to build coalitions to think about how we can enhance our collective impacts. We're being driven by this shared mission, even though the ways oppression and inclusion is expressed locally differ. And so that diversity of expression, the diversity of communities served is really important. And so I think that actually also connects to the previous question that we had. I really want to highlight that, yes, different groups have very different experiences from when we think about the many different indigenous communities that we had here on Turtle Island and Australia and other places. And that, for everybody else, we're all immigrants or children of immigrants. And the specific colonial or non-colonial histories we might have experienced, or histories of racism that we or our parents or grandparents, previous generations experienced, are very important to take into account. I also want to be very careful when we talk about international students, to think about right now how now and in the past we've thought of the international as the other, particularly at a time where we see, with respect to undocumented students, many students who are coming from Central and South America as well, from Mexico, how they're being stigmatized. I think, all of us have a moral imperative as geoscientists to stand up for those students just as much as we believe that we all need to stand up for, people who are from underrepresented minority groups.
Okay, well, we welcome the next question. We just have a little bit of time, but enough time, certainly, for your question.
As a fairly new administrator, do you have suggestions that we can utilize from an administrative side to help make progress on this issue? And I'll clarify by saying I'm coming from very white southern West Virginia. Thanks.
Can you just elaborate just a little bit about the admin level and?
I'm a new dean of science.
Great.
What action items can I take or recommend to the people above me?
This is from my perspective, of course, is that you can provide incentives in many respects for departments for hiring, for example, faculty. There was a stage at which El Paso itself, the reason why I was hired was because the president no longer approved any any faculty hire in the department until they hired minorities. And until then, there was no minority faculty in the Department of Geosciences. So at times, it's going to be very unpopular, but and it's sort of like when you were talking about like expertise, right? And quota, expertise that, there's no one out there. I would challenge that there are definitely people out there, and it would be interesting for you as a dean of science to go visit some of these organizations and the conferences to see the talent that's out there. And to really, really use this as an opportunity to recruit the next generation. And the faculty is what, as a former chair, that's the legacy that you leave behind. It's the hires that you have. And if a chair has the support of a dean to bring in people, and it's not just minorities, I would say. I would say that if you want to hire a female faculty member in your department, in sciences, I think the number was, when I was a chair, like 65% of women that can become faculty members were married to someone in the same field. So you have to be ready to do dual hires. And so there's lots of opportunities to do those kind of things that you bring in, and you have to be willing to use those lines and to be committed to those, and then support them. I mean, that's really, really important. I mean, to make sure that they are successful. No challenges with, startup issues and whatnot. So being a former administrator, I would say that those are the actions that you could take that would have immediate impact.
Another aspect that I would love for deans to tackle is rewarding effective mentoring of grad students and sort of getting marginalized grad students through the system have them thrive in the system, not just get them through. I don't want this to be a sort of passive thing, but to allow those students to thrive and to incentivize those programs that are doing that well.
Great. Ambrose, and then we will have time for just one final question after your
Just
response.
one quick thing, I think, is you said West Virginia. Just as a cute thing, Katherine Johnson, one of the hidden figures, is from West Virginia and had a stint there. But what I want to say is I would suggest that if you don't already know about the Compact for Faculty Diversity, to get in touch with them. I think it's funded by or it's sponsored by the Southern Association or something, and one of the philanthropic organizations. But it is a good resource to at least investigate.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Sure.
Hey, good afternoon. David Padgett, Tennessee State University, one of our 100 or so historically black colleges and universities. Good evening, Dr. Washington, Dr. Ambrose. I just wanted to talk about something called weaponizing white privilege. I had a couple of cases actually I can count them on my hand. 2 cases where I had white administrators actually come to my defense when things were happening to me that were racist, whereas before, when I was, part of the reason I'm at Tennessee State University is because of these experiences. But where I was in previous predominantly white institutions, the white administrators would always say, oh, it's not racism, you're delusional. One white person said, well, maybe you're scaring the students because you move your hands a lot when you talk, you're scaring the white students. And I can go over and over again. But then I've had like 2 cases where white administrators have come to my defense and weaponized their white privilege, and it completely changed the situation instantly. Unfortunately, in one case, I got my first faculty position because black students took over the university, took over the computer center, took over the library, and one of their demands was to hire tenure-track black faculty. I was one of those tenure-track black faculty that the president hired, but he was summarily run out of town by the rest of the racist whites in the community. So how do we get our white brothers and sisters to weaponize their white privilege? Because there will be retribution from the white supremacist side. You know, and there's a saying that we just say, there's only thing people hate worse than is a lover. You know what I'm saying? I don't want to say that out loud, but that's kind of the situation that we're in.
Well, it was interesting, it's David, right? In the film, the part 2 of Can We Talk film series that was debuted yesterday, there was a whole segment on allies. So, you know, getting buy-in from white leadership on our campuses. And it was interesting when the participants in the film were asked to define an ally, there was quite a lot of hesitation because you're not even sure who, like, can you really trust this person? You know, what does it mean to be an ally? You know, who really will come to your defense? And it's one thing to come to your defense, but will they also extend that kind of leadership and support across campus? So that is one of the hardest things, and I know can appreciate why you would bring that to the panel, because there's only so much we can do, right, to move us forward if we're not in leadership position and if we're, you know, at PWIs. And so this whole piece about allies and really getting the buy-in in the leadership majority, I think, is continuing to need work. Yes.
Is that going to be on the internet on that film?
We're talking, she's still editing, so it's Kendall. The filmmaker at University of Rhode Island, she's still editing the piece that we previewed yesterday. It was the debut, but I'm assuming it'll be ready pretty soon. So we'll be able, I'm sure, through our leadership at AGU to let the community know when it's available, because, yeah, that part of the film was powerful.
I'll just say a few comments. I wouldn't be here without, I mean, if there's no Hispanic geoscientists out there, you know, that means that I've been mentored along, and I've had advocates along the way of my career. And that's, you know, that's the one thing we don't want to make sure that we push away, is that sort of assistance and help, because literally I wouldn't be here without that sort of support at all different levels. And so I think, you know, I think part of our challenge is having that difficult conversation. You said that great in your presentation, that sometimes it's very uncomfortable for people to hear this. They don't know that we go through this. I don't think my, you know, Irish colleagues or the internet, you know, understand some of the issues that we go through being a minority in a field where there's just none. And so, and that sort of marginalization that can happen is tough. And to have that sort of difficult conversation with people can be really, really tough. But I think that you know, it's finding those advocates along the way, or them finding you, and that's really what's happened to me. Very lucky. I'm very lucky to be here because I've had people along the way that have actually plucked me out and encouraged me to continue on. And so I think that that's sort of, you know, as we go, anyone can be doing that to each other, and if we can, you know, pay it forward, that's exactly what we should be doing to everyone that follows behind us, no matter what their background is.
I just want to say, too, one of the things I'd like to give a plug for is that I'm of the opinion now that the HBCUs, for example, the historically black colleges and universities, the other minority-serving institutions that are tribal or in Latino, Hispanic communities out of the Pacific Islands, et cetera. it's high time, I think, that we as scientists and as educators look to these institutions and ask and look to be intentional about learning how have they survived all these years and done the outstanding jobs that they have done in terms of the relative number of persons they have sent on to higher education in various fields, but in particular in science. And so I think it's an untapped, unutilized resource when we are wrestling with these global issues right now, but right here at home in the USA. And so I'm saying AGU, again, all boats aren't necessarily lifted, okay? And some are stranded. And so we need to reach into these institutions to address the issues of the occupational and educational realities that we are concerned about.
Well, in closing, I'll say it's only Tuesday of AGU week, and there are many more diversity and inclusion and ethics-themed sessions while we're here this week. There's a field guide, so our committee and Billy Williams was instrumental in putting together an ethics, diversity, and inclusion field guide for the week. And so there are more opportunities to have conversations, to listen to experts. And this evening, the Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Committee, we're holding a town hall in Moscone West at 6:15. So grab a beer, come over, let's talk some more. And thank you so much to the speakers and panelists. It's been a great afternoon.